Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, in this podcast, it's the third and final episode in our series on how to implement ISO 45001, the health and safety standard. Welcome back, Paul Robinson.
Thank you, Mel.
Great, thanks for joining us again. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about the launch and communication of that health and safety system, looking at the compliance to the system and how to evidence that compliance. So it's basically the final steps prior to an assessment. So talking about hints and tips and sharing advice around that. Before we delve into the launch, what advice would you give companies before we kind of get to that stage after we've documented the management system?
Yes, so hopefully by now you'll have something tangible. You'll have some documented information there, to use the words of the standard, around you, with things like, for example, a policy statement, risk assessments, a legal register possibly, and some operational control procedures. Before we put it out there to the organisation and effectively launch it, I think it's really important to take a step back and go back to stage one of what we've talked about and revisit the gap analysis and ask ourselves, have we addressed all of those findings from the gap analysis within the body of our management system?
Good point, yeah.
I think that's absolutely crucial. There's nothing worse than putting a management system out there, doing a big launch, getting the party poppers out and all the rest of it, and putting it out there. And
if you've missed something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
and it's so embarrassing to have to go back, revisit it. Accepting, of course, that management systems evolve, and quite rightly, processes, procedures should evolve, once the management system is out there. So the launch day is really important. It's an opportunity for us to basically put a stake in the ground and say, right, from today, we're adopting the requirements of this management system, and we're going to be working towards driving continual improvement in our occupational health and safety performance. Anything that's gone before that needs to not necessarily be forgotten, but bad practices certainly we need to park and say, right, from today, we're going forward with the new approach. Top management, again, have a key part to play in this, in driving the cultures and the correct behaviours associated with the adoption of the management system approach. Remembering, of course, that top management have put their name on the policy, so they've committed to all of these things, driving continual improvement, preventing injury and ill health, etc. So how we put the management system out there is down to the organisation itself, and there's a number of methods in doing that. It could be a formal launch, get everybody together. It could be done through cascading through senior management. Some organisations have entire departments dedicated to communication who can put it out for you. Remembering, though, that it needs to get down to the workers ultimately. So whatever mechanisms we're using for communication in the organisation, that needs to be effective throughout the whole organisation.
I think going back to one of the other ISO shows episodes when we were talking about leadership commitment, I think we were talking about that in the first episode, weren't we, on the steps of success with ISO 45001.
Yeah.
You explained how important it was, and I think looking at the number of convictions still in the UK, I think this is hopefully brings home a really important point, that it is down to leadership, because at the end of the day, if, God forbid, something does go terribly wrong and there is a conviction, and there are a number of convictions in the UK. I think according to HSE, back in the 2017 stats, there were 554 cases that resulted in conviction for at least one offence. And in fact, almost half of those, 206 were in construction. They have got to take it seriously, haven't they?
Absolutely.
So, this is really important, because I think sometimes organisations might have a health and safety policy statement, and they might have some health and safety controls, and that might be because they get asked for it in tenders. And they might have somebody that, it's part of their responsibility, but not their entire responsibility to take care of health and safety for the organisation. But it's not always clearly communicated.
No, absolutely.
And it'd be interesting to see, out of those 554 cases that did result in conviction, what did they have in place And was it clearly communicated?
Yeah.
Because this is obviously where the convictions come in, because they can't demonstrate evidence of having those systems in place, those controls and policies and procedures, and making sure that it happens on a daily basis. It's not just a paper exercise.
Absolutely. Fundamental to that is having a suitable and sufficient risk assessment in place for the activity that was taking place. I think it's worth mentioning that the HSE are incredibly effective in their jobs. One of the stats that I'm aware of is I think in 94% of cases that they brought to court, they've actually secured a prosecution.
Wow, that is phenomenal, isn't it?
Yeah. They absolutely don't mess about.
That's for sure.
And where they are confident that they can secure a conviction, and that can involve people going to prison or significant fines.
9 times out of 10 they'll get one.
Absolutely.
By the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Well, they're just doing the job at the end of the day, aren't they? Which
Yeah.
is protecting the welfare and the safety of people in the UK. So you can't argue against that, can you?
No,
they're only doing their
absolutely.
job, and they're there for a very good reason. So communication then, so you mentioned about cascading it down from leadership right through to workers. Could you explain what could be involved with the communications plan then? You mentioned if you've got a department, then brilliant, you could hand that over to them, couldn't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
And they could manage that all on your behalf, which would be great. So what sort of things could a small business do if they've got, say, 10 or 20 employees?
So typical activities, again, could be a launch. The standard mandates that, for example, in the awareness clause, there's a requirement to engage with workers and also let them know about things like the policy statement, the company objectives, how they play their part in driving improvement in health and safety, and the mechanisms for them to bring forward suggestions, ideas, worst case scenario concerns around health and safety, and make sure that they are, again, from a consultation participation perspective, involved and engaged in that process. So a number of mechanisms, inductions I mentioned, again, are another great way of setting your stall out really and establishing that standard right from day one, particularly when we've been talking about construction organisations. If you're stepping onto a construction site for the first time, you want that induction to include that information around the health and safety management system and the role that they play in that.
Yes, it's not just for new employees, but it could be for existing employees and also for any workers that are acting on your behalf, so suppliers, contractors and things like
Absolutely,
that. Yeah.
One key thing there is that language and capability can come into play with that. So it may be that the organisation needs to adopt its approach. We were talking about Brexit and the number of workers who maybe English isn't their first language. Again, we need to think about those people, those workers, and how we engage with them and make them aware of the health and safety management system requirements.
So communication can include signage as well then, can't it? So in some cases the signage could be in a particular language like English, but you can have signage like a fire exit sign where you don't need words, you've just got an image there.
Absolutely.
So I guess it's looking at the most effective way of communicating your controls within your organisation to those interested parties, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, that comes back to consulting with them as to what the most appropriate method and means is for them to get the best understanding.
And is it helpful for an employee within the organisation to have qualifications in health and safety, like a NEBOSH qualification?
Well, certainly within organisations there's a requirement for a competent person, and typically that competent person would have as a minimum a NEBOSH general certificate. I would always strongly recommend that. Supporting that, again, it's useful for the management team to be aware of their specific health and safety responsibilities, and that distinction, as I was coming back to talking earlier about that distinction between accountability and the ability to delegate responsibility. Understanding that distinction between those two terms is absolutely critical for top managers.
So potentially an internal training session for the leadership team on certain responsibilities, accountabilities associated with the health and safety system.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like obviously the objectives, because you want them to drive that forward.
Yeah.
Legal requirements, so that they have an awareness of that.
Yeah. And again, the standard is very prescriptive in clause 5.1 in defining what those leadership responsibilities are and the part that leadership has in driving the management system, not only just embedding it within the business, but again driving that continuing improvement and promoting a culture within the organisation where health and safety is not seen as something that's a negative thing. It's actually a positive thing in protecting, again, injury and ill health to workers.
Okay, so let's hope it's been communicated to everybody at this stage then. Everybody's heard about the system, they're aware of their responsibilities, how to access that health and safety system. The next stage is making sure everybody's complying, isn't it? So how do you demonstrate and evidence that compliance then, Paul?
Right, so it's out there. It's people are using it, and people are familiarising themselves with the policies, procedures, how they play their part in ensuring the health and safety of workers. We then start to monitor and measure those activities, get some stats from that information, and start to build up data and evidence of conformity. We can then test that evidence of conformity through internal auditing and also evaluations of compliance with those legal requirements that we talked about. So within the organisation, or through the use of consultants, we need to develop a programme of internal audits. And again, that programme should be risk-based and look at where the most significant areas of risk are within the organisation. And again, we focus our attention towards that. But it also should cover off all of the requirements of the standard, all the clauses from 4 to 10, and also consider, again, in a sort of process-based approach, the operational controls that we developed, that we talked about in the last podcast. Those audits then should be recorded, retained as documented information and records, and again, those findings from audits should be then fed into management review, along with the information that we've got now from our monitoring and measuring activities, the results of consultation and participation with our staff.
So the management, sorry to interrupt, but the management review, for listeners, that's a management review meeting, isn't it, with key players then that have been involved in the project?
Yes, I mean, it can be a meeting, but equally, I don't necessarily mandate that it has to be a meeting. It can be a process, it could be a series of meetings. It could be, for example, maybe a presentation back to the top management on how the management system is performing.
But there still needs to be an input and an output, you said,
absolutely
which is
critical,
described in the standard, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, the standard helps us in that respect with providing, as you say, the input requirements of what we need to cover, such as things like internal audits, non-conformities, results of accidents and incidents, and results of consultation and participation. That enables then top management to make a decision on, ultimately, is the management system suitable, sufficient and adequate, and ultimately, is it driving continual improvement and the right behaviours within the organisation. The outputs of that management review then are documented, and that will then in turn lead to then a new round of planning, so where we could talk about issues, interested parties, and whether those needs and expectations have changed or evolved slightly.
So it's that continual loop, isn't it, of improvement then?
Absolutely, yeah. So we go through this cycle, the Plan Do, Check Act cycle, which we've been promoting obviously through the ISO shows.
Yes, Fantastic. Okay, so then I guess you're good to go for the assessment at that stage then?
Yep, at that stage you've completed effectively a full cycle of that Plan Do Check Act cycle. The management system is out there, it's been communicated, we're running with it. We've built up that documented information, that evidence that we need to put in front of a certification body, for example. And that leads us into a two-stage process. The stage one is effectively a documentation review. And at that point, the certification body assessor will come in and ensure that the management system that we've created meets the documented requirements of the standard. So that's generally a tabletop, desktop review of the management system. Then there's a pause. If there's any findings from that audit, then obviously we've got time to address those, which then takes us into our stage 2 assessment, which is a more deeper dive into the standard. And at that stage, the assessor is going to be getting out, talking to people, looking at the effectiveness of the management system. Has it been communicated out to people? Are the workers involved in that consultation and participation? Is the leadership setting the right tone for the organisation and driving those behaviours and a positive safety culture? Have we built up the relevant records? Are we conducting our audits effectively? Are we assessing and properly, effectively addressing the root causes of problems and corrective actions or non-conformities as they've arisen within the business? So all of these things are assessed, and then ultimately that will lead then to a recommendation for certification.
Awesome. Well, I think it's fair to say that you've just provided so much information and guidance and support for listeners if they are thinking about looking at the standard, and even if it's not for certification, it's just to improve health and safety within their organisation, and they want to use that as some kind of benchmark to, review their organisation again. So that's been absolutely fantastic, Paul. Obviously, we haven't gone through clause by clause. This isn't what the podcast is all about. It's just sharing hints and tips and guidance and sharing some real-life examples. But we have got some further information on our website, and there'll be a blog that goes with this podcast with links to some of the things that Paul mentioned, like the HSE website. So that provides further information and guidance. And we'll also provide a link for our ISO 45001 webinar that Paul recorded a while ago, and that's to help those organisations that are looking at migrating from 18,001, the old health and safety standard, over to 45,001. And finally, if you are interested in hearing more about each individual clause, we haven't covered things like emergency preparedness, we haven't covered absolutely everything, but there's more detail within the standard. We've got an e-learning course